Stand with me on the riverbank at dawn, watching an army that has never crossed this water before. Behind you, roughly 45,000 Roman soldiers wait in full battle order, 4 legions and their auxiliaries, assembled on an island the Romans themselves had spent a century treating as the edge of the known world. Ahead, across the water, a coalition of British tribes has gathered specifically to make sure this crossing never actually happens. Neither side has any reason yet to believe this will take 2 full days to settle, or that this single crossing will decide whether Rome finally succeeds at something Julius Caesar himself had already failed to accomplish here nearly a century earlier. What does it actually take to conquer an island Rome itself once called the edge of the world? If you want the real, verified story of the battle that opened Roman Britain, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. Britain had already resisted Rome once, nearly a century earlier. Julius Caesar himself led 2 separate expeditions across the Channel in 55 and 54 BC, extracting tribute and diplomatic promises from a handful of British tribes, but never establishing anything resembling permanent Roman control, an unfinished conquest that sat, deliberately unaddressed, for almost 100 years afterward. The island's real economic pull only grows in that gap. British tin, essential for bronze production, along with lead and silver, gives Rome genuine material incentive to finish what Caesar had started, on top of the propaganda value of finally succeeding where the greatest general in Roman history had conspicuously stopped short. The most recent attempt before Claudius's own does not even manage to leave the coast. In 40 AD, the Emperor Caligula marches an army to the Channel shore, apparently intending an invasion of his own, and then, for reasons the ancient sources themselves cannot satisfactorily explain, orders his own soldiers to gather seashells from the beach instead, declaring them spoils of a victory over the ocean itself, to be paraded through Rome. Whether this reflects genuine instability, a punishment for a mutiny the sources simply don't record directly, or a mistranslation of a term also used for captured enemy ships, historians still argue. What is certain is that Caligula's Britain campaign ends in humiliation without a single soldier ever crossing the water, leaving the actual conquest for Claudius to attempt 3 years later. This entire invasion very nearly never leaves the coast of Gaul either. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius, only recently and shakily installed on a throne he never expected to hold, needs a decisive military victory to secure his own legitimacy, and Britain offers a convenient pretext. Verica, a British king allied with Rome, had recently been driven from his own kingdom by the rival Batavian tribe and fled to Rome itself asking for help. That request gives Claudius exactly the justification he needs to launch an invasion he also, quite separately, badly needs for his own political survival. The army assembled for that invasion very nearly refuses to go. When the legions are finally ordered to actually board their ships and cross open ocean to an island most of them have only heard described as lying beyond the edge of the civilized world, they mutiny outright, refusing to sail. The man Claudius sends to talk them down is not a general at all. It is Narcissus, Claudius's own freedman secretary, a former slave now attempting to order legionary soldiers back into formation. The soldiers' actual response is not fury. It is mockery. Seeing a former slave standing before them attempting to give military orders, they begin shouting Io Saturnalia, the traditional cry of the winter festival when masters and slaves briefly traded places for a day, treating the entire scene as exactly the kind of absurd role reversal that festival was built around. The joke itself breaks the tension enough that the mutiny simply dissolves, and the fleet finally sails, saved not by threats or discipline, but by an army deciding its own commander's messenger was too ridiculous to actually defy. Now watch that fleet actually make landfall, and feel how quiet that landing turns out to be. You watch the legions come ashore on the Kent coast largely unopposed, the British tribes choosing not to contest the beaches directly, retreating instead to gather their full strength further inland. Under the overall command of Aulus Plautius, the Roman army advances steadily through Kent, 4 legions strong, including the Second Augusta, commanded by a general named Vespasian who has no way of knowing, marching through this unfamiliar Kentish countryside, that he himself will one day rule the empire he is currently fighting to expand. It is here that the British coalition, led by 2 brothers of the Catuvellauni tribe, Togodumnus and Caratacus, finally chooses its ground. A crossing point on the river Medway, water the Romans will have to force their way across if they intend to advance any further into Britain at all. Ancient writers describe the British coalition as numbering as many as 150,000 warriors drawn from multiple tribes. a figure modern historians treat with real skepticism given how difficult coordinating a force that size would have actually been for a coalition of independent tribal groups rather than a single unified army. Whatever their true numbers, the exact crossing point itself remains genuinely disputed among historians today. The traditional site near modern Rochester sits on water too wide and too tidal for the battle, as described to have realistically taken place there, and more likely candidates further upstream, where the river narrows enough for a contested crossing to actually make tactical sense, remain the subject of ongoing archaeological argument rather than settled fact. If watching an entire invasion nearly collapse over one former slave's absurd authority interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. The Medway itself offers no bridge at the crossing point the British have chosen, and the water is neither shallow nor easily forded by an army in full kit. Claudius's answer is a detachment of Batavian auxiliaries, soldiers recruited specifically from a Germanic tribe famous for a skill most Roman legionaries never bothered to master, fighting effectively while swimming in full armor. These men slip into the river and cross it directly, bypassing the obvious crossing point entirely, and strike specifically at the horses pulling British war chariots on the far bank, disabling the one weapon system the British coalition had counted on to dominate open ground. If the idea that Rome's opening move here was neither a bridge nor a frontal assault, but soldiers trained specifically to swim into battle interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. Now feel this fight refuse to end quickly, and feel how close it comes to going the other way entirely. You watch the first day of fighting end without any real resolution, both sides still holding ground as darkness falls, an outcome neither army had planned for. On the second day, the battle turns dangerously uncertain for Rome at exactly the wrong moment. A Roman detachment under the command of Gnaeus Hosidius Geta comes close enough to being overrun that Geta himself has to personally rally his own collapsing formation, standing his ground at the center of a line that was, by every account, minutes away from breaking entirely. That rally holds. The British line, pressed hard enough for long enough, finally gives way, scattering back from the river in a general retreat that ends 2 days of fighting neither side had expected to last this long. The retreat does not simply end at the Medway. The surviving British forces fall back further still, to the Thames itself, where a second engagement finishes what the Medway started. Togodumnus, one of the two brothers who had led the British coalition into this fight, dies in the fighting that follows, either from wounds taken in that second engagement or shortly afterward. Caratacus survives. He will not stop fighting Rome for another 8 years. Before we return to that riverbank one last time, if this channel's telling of history, the honest kind that keeps the mutiny and the near defeat alongside the eventual victory, is something you want to carry with you, our own merchandise is linked below. At the Thames, Aulus Plautius makes a deliberate choice that says as much about Roman politics as it does about military strategy. Rather than push on immediately toward the Cativelonian capital himself, he halts his own advance and sends word back to Claudius, inviting the emperor to come finish the campaign personally. Claudius accepts, crossing to Britain with reinforcements and remarkably war elephants, animals no one on this island has ever seen before, and leads the final march on Camulodunum, modern Colchester himself. The political calculation is not subtle. Claudius needs to be seen conquering Britain in person, not simply receiving a report of a victory won entirely by his generals, and Plautius, whatever his own personal ambition might have preferred, understands exactly whose triumph this campaign is actually supposed to become. Claudius's own political calculation pays off handsomely once news of the victory reaches Rome. 11 British kings and tribal leaders formally submit to him at Camulodunum, a scene later commemorated across the empire, and the Senate votes him a full triumph along with the honorary title Britannicus, awarded to his own son as well. A triumphal arch, dedicated years later in 51 AD, rises on the northern approach into Rome itself specifically to commemorate this campaign, permanent stone testimony to a conquest that had, at its actual moment of crisis on the Medway's second day, come uncomfortably close to falling apart entirely. Caratacus does not surrender when Camulodunum falls. He retreats west, continuing to organize resistance against the Roman occupation for years afterward, shifting the fight into Wales and drawing on tribes far beyond his own original Catuvellauni power base. That resistance finally ends in 51 AD, when Roman forces under Governor Ostorius Scapula defeat him decisively in a final pitched battle in the hills of what is now Wales. Caratacus survives that defeat too, fleeing north to seek shelter with the Brigantes tribe under their own queen, Cartimandua, a ruler whose kingdom depends heavily on staying on Rome's good side. Rather than risk her own standing by sheltering the empire's most wanted enemy, Cartimandua hands Caratacus over to the Romans in chains, a betrayal by a fellow Briton that ends 8 years of resistance more decisively than any Roman legion had managed to on its own. What happens next is one of the more genuinely striking scenes in the entire history of Rome's relationship with the people it conquered. Caratacus is paraded through Rome as a captured enemy leader, and rather than simply being executed as an example, he is given the chance to speak before Claudius and the Roman Senate directly. The historian Tacitus records the substance of that speech. Caratacus does not beg. He argues with evident dignity that his own former greatness only makes Rome's eventual victory over him more glorious, that had his own restraint matched his rank, he might have come to Rome as a friend rather than a captive, and that his present humiliation, however painful to him personally, only adds to Rome's own glory in defeating him. The Senate is reportedly moved. Claudius pardons him, sparing Caratacus's life along with his family's, and the man who had resisted Roman conquest longer than any other British leader of this entire campaign lives out the remainder of his life in Rome itself, not as a prisoner, but by most accounts as a free man. So think back to that riverbank at dawn, to two armies that had no idea this crossing would take 2 full days to settle. You were never simply watching one battle open one province. You were watching an invasion that nearly collapsed before it even sailed, saved by soldiers who found their own emperor's messenger too absurd to keep defying, won at its hardest moment by one officer's refusal to let his own line break, and completed not by the general who actually won it, but by the emperor who needed the credit more. And you were watching it end, 8 years and one further campaign later, not with an execution but with a captured king's own words moving the very Senate that had conquered him into letting him live. That is the Medway, and everything it actually set in motion, stranger and more human than the clean textbook version of Rome's conquest of Britain usually allows. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the invasions that nearly fell apart before they began, the battles won by the smallest personal decisions rather than grand strategy, the endings that turned on dignity rather than the sword, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the shadow.